Dear colleagues, good morning. Friends, welcome to the UCF Art Gallery. We are gathered today for the delight of witnessing Sheherazade Thenard's thesis defense and partial completion of the MFA in Emerging Media, Studio Art and Design. It is appropriate we begin with thanks. Many people work together to make this happen. It includes the College of Graduate Studies and the College of Arts and Humanities, Associate Dean Lynn Hepner, Dr. Anastasia Salta, Carla Grip in that office do a lot of work to bring everything together for us. Here in the School of Visual Arts and Design, of course, Rudy McDaniel, Jessica Wen, Stephen Blackburn, Christine Michael, Janky Mirage, make things happen on our local end. And then in the gallery, Shannon Lindsay, Larry Cooper, and Jean-Claude Roche do heavy lifting to make this fantastic show come together. Our agenda for today will begin with Sheherazade's thesis defense, after which we'll proceed to questions and questions only from the thesis committee. This is not a critique, but an academic review. After questions from the committee, we'll proceed with questions to the audience online. People will be able to type into the Zoom chat or activate their microphone or raise their hand here in the audience. Again, I remind you, this is not a time for critique, sharing of opinions, but rather for questions and questions only. After that, the thesis committee will deliberate. We'll ask the audience to step away. We'll all meet in the atrium, I suppose, and they will debate on Sheherazade's accomplishments and paths forward. So please join me in welcoming to the highlight of my morning, Sheherazade Thenard's thesis defense.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Sheherazade Thenard, and I am presenting my graduate oral defense. To begin, okay. All right. Sorry, that clicking was strange. All right. So to begin, I would like to thank my committee of Wanda Ramundi Ortiz, Carla Poindexter, Elenia Colon Mendoza, who could not be here today, and Theo Lotz for providing careful and insightful guidance through this thesis. And to my family and friends who've supported me, y'all know who you are. All right. So my presentation is titled, The Hands That Hold You, Negotiating Relationships Between Self and the Conjured Landscape. In this presentation, I will be covering chronological evolution of thought through figuration, visual symbols, and the abstraction of the landscape. The subjects of these paintings depict my reflections on self-portraiture, family, friends, and visions of my ancestors. These works are expressed through printmaking and painting. My work explores my relationship to self and identity exploration through my art making. As a Black woman scholar and second-generation child to immigrants from Martinique, growing up in the Florida suburbs, I am constantly negotiating my space in the Southern American landscape. This research addresses the autobiographical discoveries I make and continue to make regarding the intersections of womanhood, sexuality, class, and how gender roles influence the spaces I inhabit. I choose this photo of baby me mirroring my grandfather clearing weeds in the yard of his upstate New York farmhouse because it sets the tone for so much of what my work's content is. So early work. Over the summer of high school graduation, before beginning my undergraduate degree at UCF, I was making paintings that dealt with women wielding tangible power with commanding gazes and abstract elements that swirled around the picture plane. This early work is the beginning of my choosing to abstract the landscape. But ultimately, I felt a disconnect between me and what I wanted to say in this painting. After beginning my undergraduate program, my mentor, Carla Poindexter, showed me this painting by April Gornick. April Gornick is a contemporary artist who paints landscapes with plein air realism informed by abstracted memories. Carla stated that these landscapes carried a funerary aspect to them, holding the weight of Gornick's experiences. This made me ask the classic question of how can I imbue a landscape painting with content that is important to me? At this time, I made a series of plein air landscape studies around Orlando. Formally, I wanted to understand layering the landscape information through impressionistic rendering, capturing filtered light and the passing of time. In these paintings, I memorialize natural Florida wildfires, where semi-annually coastal wetland pines will release a sap that sets trees ablaze, making room for local species to thrive. The cycle of regeneration interested me. I attempted to capture the wildflowers that bloom after the fire, telling a story that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. These studies helped me understand the landscape through naturalism, so that I had a better handle of what the landscape looked like and how it functioned, so that I can continue to abstract it. One of the first successful pieces that balanced those concerns was the painting The Spoils of May, where I begin to introduce heightened natural color through undulating tones of warmth and cool. It features lush zones of plants that push for dominance in their growth, and a garden sculpture of Persephone, a spring goddess, exiting the picture plane, but spurning the events forward. Moving on, I want to show the photographic work of Deanna Lawson. Lawson is a photo-based artist whose work examines the body's ability to channel personal and social histories. Her compositions address themes of familial legacy, community, romance, and religious spiritual aesthetics. Lawson is visually inspired by the materiality of Black culture and its expression as seen through the body and in domestic environments. In this photo by Lawson, it holds the gravity of a man visiting the community garden of a memorial of 9 victims from his church, or 9 members from his church, who were victims of the Charleston mass shooting of 2015. This image carries the emotional weight of a haunting memory. Not to compare my life's events to this moment, but I had experienced my first close family loss. My grandmother passed suddenly, and that rocked me. I decided to continue my degree's progress, but the content of my work, pictured here or not, became a means of mourning. At the conclusion of BFA, I made a series of work exploring figuration and the landscape, with these figures carrying complex emotions expressed through body language and expression. Often this expression was beckoning, asking the viewer to join them in these small escapist gestures of entering dense landscapes. The self-portrait titled Secrets in Soil dealt with my interior state of mind. The figure is comfortably cornered while imagined plants interact with them. Obscuring the viewer's view are flowering weeds that sway and large lilies whose form conform to the figure, caressing their face as it's ready to swallow them. Graduate work. As I returned to UCF to pursue my graduate degree, I was reintroduced to the figurative work of contemporary painter Kerry James Marshall. Marshall's ability to convey punctual and ironic narratives of the Black experience in America has always inspired me. Pictured here are from his vignette series, where I include a quote from his Art 21 on why he created these paintings. It reads, "The work of African-American artists has for a long time been seen more as a kind of social phenomena instead of aesthetic phenomena. The social implications of the work, be it identity politics and things like that, seem to be privileged in terms of the way the work is received, as opposed to any kind of aesthetic project or intervention the work might be organized around." If you examine the subjectivity that a lot of African-American artists address, it often has a kind of cultural, social, political, or historical angle to it. So for the mainstream to suggest that it has become tired of having to address these kinds of issues, I thought maybe the only thing that was left to do was to make paintings about love. This made me think about the power of representing what I organize my life around, what I love. I love painting the landscape, figures, my friends and family. I love my culture and I love stories. I began this program challenged with the task of making a series of experimental paintings that would help inform my studio practice. This challenge was about entering into my content without the limits of perfectionism, allowing myself to make mistakes and intuitively respond with time constraints. To aid this process, I chose to work on non-absorbent and slick surfaces like Mylar or Yupo sheets. These slick surfaces allowed me to express light, composition, and movement in ways I had not before with figures in the landscape. These paintings help me understand material and explore the limits of oil paint by scratching into surfaces using broader brushstrokes and with paint spirits to work so translucently the white of the Yupo or Mylar would show through. Here, I feature a woman entering the edge of a romantic landscape, barefoot on rocks. I wanted to see how loosely I could paint the landscape information while maintaining legibility of space and distance. In this painting, there is a seated woman in a yard obscured by a loosely rendered mango tree. The action of the figure is unclear, but their posture suggests an ease. Both figures appear to be isolated and engaged in their interior worlds. All right. In addition to the figurative work, I made a series of quick fruit studies that had cultural relevance to me, ranging from mangoes, bananas, and ginger plants. In this painting titled "We Used to Sit Under the Mango Tree," I wanted to create a space that still carried a story despite the lack of a clear figure or absence with evidence. This painting catalyzed me thinking about memories surrounding my mother's house, having spent most of my life moving. This is the first time my mother's house became a landmark for memory, putting roots down from a literal standpoint. One of the first gestures my mother made to the landscape was to plant 33 varieties of plants that could be used for their fruit, leaves, or medicinally. All right. In Your Feet in the Wet Soil, I capture this love labor in a scroll-like sheet of mylar featuring a self-portrait rescuing fallen fruit in a wicker basket to bring back to my family. The crouching pose and gesture of this self-portrait was derived from the market woman, an ancient Greek sculpture. On searching for this image, initially, I typed the market woman on Google. My results yielded women vending goods at markets anywhere from the coast of Lago to the Caribbean. This strange irony of looking for a Greek antiquity sculpture and revealing an entire genre of Black women vendors reminded me of a photo series I had created in undergrad. And if you're looking for her, she is in the middle of the top row. That is the sculpture I was referencing, the rest being what they are. This mini photographic series, completed at undergrad, was titled Plastic Paradise, where I photographed several self-portraits performing different aspects of what Island appeared to be through photographic advertisements. In this image, I shuffle a variety of food materials looking to make a meal that will never be made. It was an early means of engaging with the feeling of disconnectedness to a culture my family expressed casually, but I couldn't access. So I entered the role through performance. I started to think about the stifling heat of Martinique, being enveloped by this imaginary foliage, pushed by a sea breeze or a plastic fan. And the sweat that would drip down my skin after a long day, or from a heat lamp that left me with actual tan lines. This led me into Chamois, a series of miniature paintings translating to our house. And it features 31 miniature paintings that explore my personal projection of Martiniquois imagery and how I've interpreted the oral history of life my family experienced beyond how I've come to know them. As a result of having never experienced life in the islands, as my immediate family has, I sought to balance my yearning for connection to my heritage and imposter syndrome. My research for this project began by using family photos, Virgin Island iconography, and imaginary photos I've taken. This format gave me the autonomy to rearrange each miniature painting to form a memory as I saw it, inserting my current romantic understanding into my family's history formation versus how it might have been. Like pieces of a puzzle, when properly assembled, these smaller pieces begin to illustrate a larger story and bridge my desire for connection. For me, this series functioned as a means of capturing the communion of the dinner table talks I held so dearly between my mother, grandmother, and I. I began by prepping a large piece of paper and ripping small, roughly 3 by 3 squares, and explored elements of our conversation in oil. In my mother's home, she had a cookbook, and in it, there were several snapshots taken of Saint Martin, another island, and it resembled what my mother and grandmother reminisced about during their time in Martinique. When I told my mother about the painting project I desired to undertake, she sent me not only the images in the cookbook, but she'd also completed digitizing our family photo album that my grandmother had possession of before she passed. This was a revelation for me. I had not seen most of these photos prior and had computer access to the collection. It became a collaboration between my extended family to add to this online collection. In it, I saw my grandmother young in ways I only saw remnants of as a child. The color palette of this work was imaginative, limited, creating soft hazes over seductive gazes that questioned the viewer, asking for them to seek answers. All right. I feature the work of Lorna Simpson here as it relates to how I created this installation for Chamois. In Lorna Simpson's imagery, she compiled photographs that she'd purchased from thrift stores of Black people sitting for photo booth images in the 1940s and 50s, and she wanted to create this constellation of images that would have otherwise gone unseen. So she juxtaposes these images with ink paintings and places them in space. I was thinking about similar references in mine, where I wanted to create small color stories or color families and relate iconography of landscape to food platters to images of my family all together. All right, and jumping into monotypes. After completing the works above, where I expressed interest in developing looser and faster brushwork, it was suggested that I explore monotype paintings. So I took my first printmaking course here, where I broke this broad range of printmaking down. A monotype is a format of printmaking made by drawing or painting on a smooth, non-absorbent surface or plate. The first of this exploration came in the form of oil-based ink coating the surface of plexiglass plates that I would etch into. The content of these paintings were fairly similar to my miniature series, uncovering my family history and decoding their gazes for myself. Alongside these portraits, I also chose to represent long and thin teaspoons that were artifacts my mother carried with her as sentiments of her childhood from Martinique. The series is titled Exports. In it are spoons and dolls existing in a graphite gray void. This framing allowed me to give only importance to these objects so that I could reflect on them. These small exported goods all wore traditional clothing of celebration, all communicating specific meanings. Okay. This image signifies how head wraps are worn as an act of resistance after Tenon laws were placed in Louisiana and the French Caribbean in 1803. These laws stated that women of color, slave or free, should cover their hair with headdresses to refrain from excessive attention to dress. This immediately backfired when these women designed them decoratively as fashion statements. Head wraps became coded messages ranging from cultural identification, circumstances of life, or even amorous availability. Dominican artist Firley Baez is primarily a draftsman and painter who created this series of portraits and head wraps discussing the Tenon laws and other acts of resistance and self-definition. Going back to my subtractive monotypes, I was thinking about how each doll carried these messages of resistance through their clothing. I wanted to commemorate how significant this was to me as I admired the doll my mother preserved more than any Barbie I'd ever received as a child. All right. In my additive monotypes, I approached them using water-soluble media, such as watercolor, gel pastels, and water-soluble crayons to compose an image. Experimenting with these 3 paintings, I made an automatic return to dealing with the connection of figure and landscape imagery. In these plates, I felt a freedom in mark, making it feel familiar to the other paint mediums as I understood them, working through formal decisions with color, repeated pattern, and reducing marks, reductive marks. I like this method because I was never sure of what the plate would print versus what it would eliminate after the process of doing them, making successful prints feel that much more poignant. When COVID hit during the spring break of 2020, I had to pack up my studio and continue my in-person classes online. Prior, I had access to a printing press. At home, I had to make do with a wine bottle. Somehow this makeshift imagery produced prints with greater clarity, so I explored them. In these monotypes, I made a distinctive callback to my earlier work by imagining the space around my house, as my mother recalled it, overgrown from being hit with the bands of Hurricane Isaiah. I wanted to capture that feeling of these plants consuming my home in both southern swell and submersion. In this monotype, I feature a self-portrait holding my black cat in the driveway. The mango tree I featured several times at this point sways as I reveal peaks of the rest of the neighborhood. Here, I zoom into the composition of 2 young girls, my sisters, holding each other in a protective gesture, like the earlier work, Secrets in Soil. This also features a crop set of figures surrounding by plants in the yard. The Hands That Hold You is a series that commemorated that yearning that I felt to connect with my family over COVID. I couldn't see them, I couldn't access this home that I've been making work about, so I was having to rely on imagination and all of those elements that I've been working on since the beginning of grad school. I was inspired by the compositions of my monotypes. I allowed them to inform how these paintings on this wall would appear. All right. So this painting was made directly after having studio access from the quarantine. In it, I feature my 2 younger sisters as they embrace on a large rock surface in the yard under vibrantly abstracted mango trees. A neighbor's house looms behind them while a fiery sky appears to engulf the surrounding foliage. The monotype helped me establish a variety of media into my paintings. I began to utilize pastel as crayons and oil sticks as tools to illustrate the movement. They allowed me to be playful with my marks, creating visual fluidity for the suggestions of forms. The younger of my 2 sisters wears a nightgown featuring the Disney princesses Snow White and Belle. I include this as a call to my formative years growing up in Orlando with Disney. Being a huge part of my childhood, the princesses were everywhere. And when I reflect on the princesses of my childhood, Disney was not considering representation as being a part of an important narrative they wanted to portray. And when they did vary from Eurocentric folklore, they would whitewash the narratives until they were undecipherable. This is juxtaposed by the older of the 2 sisters wearing acrylic nails, which I recognize in Black American culture as symbolic to beauty and status. I adorn this element on the surface with crushed mother of pearl, a reoccurring material in the series, as it is a material naturally produced by clams and oysters as a protective coating from parasites in the ocean. The posing of these 2 figures is referencing the Pieta by Michelangelo, where Mary holds her dying son. This painting symbolizes for me the support system I wanted as a child. Seeing these 2 fills me with hope that when the veil is lifted and they see the state of the world as it is, they move through childhood, adolescence, and adulthood with greater ease. I wanted to imbue both girls with defiance and understanding. The colors of this painting are heavily informed by temperature. With this painting, something clicked. I began this painting with a gradient and built every element of it organically rather than a strict adherence to photo reference. When working, I wanted to let the color palette of these paintings be informed by Afro-Caribbean aesthetics, using pure color to illustrate movements, joy, or emotion between the atmosphere I'm creating and punctual emotions of the figures. After painting the hands that hold you between my sisters, I was reminded of being constantly made aware of the difference of skin tone between my mother and I growing up. It brought up the question of colorism and how we navigate life. I delve into this idea by exploring more extreme colors in my painting Negrita. In this painting, I reanalyze a past comment of being referred to as Negrita by a family member and relating it to my black cat, who is often referred to as Negrito, meaning little black. This is a term of endearment I frequently hear in South Florida. I hold my cat close in a nurturing and protective gesture, hinting a history of harm to black cats for their association to evil omens, trickery, and the Western symbolism of them being familiars to witches. The gaze of the figure is unashamed as they engage the viewer with ownership. The background undulates in agitation around the figure, and I render zones of my body so thinly they're almost transparent. All right. In this painting, I zoom into smaller moments that appear around the house, planting petunias around the garden. I think about works of fiction often. Specifically, magical realism interests me. After reading books like 100 Years of Solitude by Colombian author Gabriel Garcia Marquez, written in 1967, following a family doomed to repeat history over and over until a cycle runs its course. I look at those heightened elements of everyday life, moments that are so real they can almost be ascribed to being otherworldly. I'm attracted to these frozen moments of mysteries in my composition. All right, and I want to also introduce the work of Devin Shimoyama, a contemporary artist known for his depiction of Black, queer, and usually male bodies. Here is a self-portrait as it relates to a home he purchased and reflects on. For Shimoyama, this home symbolizes a landmark. He recalls moving frequently and this home being one of the first places he established a long-standing memory and routine in. Unfortunately, when purchasing, the realtors expressed that there was an attic fire previously and did not disclose if anyone had passed. Preemptively, he illustrates the practice of saging his new space with the visual tale of it still burning. He has a dog with him for comfort. The sage acts to cleanse the house of whatever was there, essentially, and bring in his own energy so he can create the space as his own. In Stickstone's Roots and Bones, as expressed prior, I depict my mother's home as a landmark of memory, a place we have made roots. In this painting, I reference a phrase from the hoodoo practice that asks that one remembers what they came from. I show my mother as a stoic, as she waters her garden at dusk, just missing the scorching summer sun. Her cast shadow on the house from a car light beam is meant to reiterate these protective gestures I've been exploring. I represent my mother's dogs in a fluster as they warn her that someone is approaching, me as I make my way home. This painting is in part inspired by the work of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, written in 1993. As a writer, Octavia Butler is concerned with illustrating topics such as race, gender, class, and how these experiences mingle with politics, climate change, and apocalyptic truths. This book, set in the futuristic year of 2023, and global warming and corporate greed have a chokehold on our economy. The world as we know it is lost. The middle class is dissolved, and homelessness and despair are the experience of the majority. This book is set in LA, California. The protagonist, Lauren Olamina, belongs to a Black family that lives within a walled neighborhood and whose father, a pastor, is a providing patriarch to the small community. They live life knowing they must depend on one another for survival and have privileges in the small community that others are eager to obtain. Outside the walls, a synthetic drug is used called pyro, and it's quickly popularized, and its effects make people hallucinate that the dancing of fire is more appealing than sex or any other pleasure, making it so that at any moment when looking at the landscape of this apocalyptic LA, you see evidence of the fire's presence. I'll stop here as I don't want to spoil anything, but know that these urgent elements inform my practice. In this painting titled Yard Work, Making Space for New Growth, I focus on my uncle after clearing excess leaves from shedding trees and take the bounty of bananas back to our house. My focus of this painting was mark making, and after completing it, I decided to wrap the edges of my wood paneled paintings with paint and extend the picture plane. Typically, I prefer raw edges, but I wanted to experiment with these paintings functioning as objects and not just 2D flat surfaces, as I felt the paintings needed them. The mark making in this painting will be important to me as I reference and continue to push the bounds of flattening space and pushing these representational paintings of leaves, of trees, of the landscape for me. In Sinnerman, I title it directly from the masterful lyrics of Nina Simone's song, Sinnerman, as it speaks to end times, as she sees it asking, who can I run to? Be it the rock, the sea, the devil, or the Lord. I tried to encompass her throaty words and voice modulation in this dancing landscape and fire in the distance. In this comparison, I pull most directly from the monotype it originated from. Elaborating on the mood and urgency in the comparison are still this backlit figure. In the detail, I wanted to point out another pop culture reference from the epic fights between the good and the morally gray in Dragon Ball Z. Additionally, the peace lilies rendered thickly with mother of pearl. Peach Pit carries a very similar motivation as Sinnerman. They share the same subject of a friend of mine, this time seated on a picnic table with a bag of Georgia peaches sprawled on the table. Carrie Mae Weems is an artist most known for her photography, where she assumes an alter ego, muse, or witness to history, who can stand in for the artist and audience. She said in these photographs, she wants to engage with history, engage with looking and being. She wants to be a guide for circumstances seldom seen in her work. This photo, titled Portrait of a Woman Who's Fallen from Grace, celebrates her right to refuse, to contradict, to say no, to be disorderly, unmanageable, and unruly. It focuses on the artists as troublemakers, looking to refusal as a generative and deeply creative process, especially when thinking about respectability politics and its negative presence on identity formation. My aim for this self-portrait was to engage in Carrie Mae Weems' many points on refusals, as I was developing the courage to wield that autonomy in my own life as I entered adulthood. I drew on the classic posing of her self-portrait, smoke in hand and defiant gaze, and the interior of my room is seen as a fortress. For those familiar, I had privacy screens on my windows which faced a public area. I chose the pattern to reflect the stained glass magnolia flowers, transforming it to be an imagined landscape in my room. I also decorate small esoteric symbols or things that I collect and I like to adorn my spaces with. All right. Okay. As the last painting in this presentation, I wanted to continue with what it is to explore interior spaces. The composition of this painting is derived from a conversation between my mother and I. On her visiting my first apartment and recalling that it reminded her of how my grandmother decorated her home when she was my age. After that meeting, she sent me this photo. Seeing this provided me with the comfort of recalling a lost relative and making a painting as a stand-in for an altar in her name and image. This painting allowed me to be playful with Sharing this comparison slide for the irony my initial composition included. I noticed I placed my cat in the composition of the painting in the same place that my grandmother had her cat crouched in a seated position in the bottom right corner. I didn't notice this initially. I noticed it well into my painting. All right. This painting allowed me to be playful with formal elements of perspective, bending and extending shadows, adjusting positive space to negative color fields. I wanted the composition to be reminiscent of my grandmother, but also infused with my own arrangements. While this painting is relatively cold in color, I wanted to make a call to these burning worlds through the simplified palm tree and landscape that I've sewn into the painting. I'm going to continue this investigation of collapsing time and geography in my work as I continue to explore new avenues with paint and print media. I want to discover the bounds of re-envisioning the past with present and future possibilities through layered and hybrid imagery. That's it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. It's time for questions from the committee.
Sure. Congratulations.
Thank you.
That was an excellent presentation. And the presentation made me really more curious about something that you weren't going to put in their time, but there was so element in that. And realizing it's three-dimensional.
Yeah.
And you talked about sewing it in a utilitarian way.
Mm-hmm.
That painting is astonishing me because of the way understanding the relationship. Will you do more of that? Will you do more bringing your elements actually into the real world, like you have with graphic design?
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in exploring other material, kind of how the mother of pearl functioned. I wanted to use material that informed my painting that wasn't too out of the bounds of what I'm familiar with, but I am breaking my comfortability. So the sewn frame it comes from my great-grandmother, who I don't get to talk about much, but my family's very matriarchal. And I met her when I was in middle school and I had a broken backpack. So she showed me how to sew in a way that was more utilitarian rather than decorative. So it will never come off, essentially. And I wanted to show that sewing on the frame, and I just kind of painted over it, letting the paint scratch in and letting it be very thick. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A question about the relationship to tradition. I'm sure that one of my questions, but seems like you approach areas of paintings that refer to the landscape. You are less connected to a particular tradition. Mm-hmm. But when you figure, there's a very conscious, almost academic way of doing that. So my question has to do with what is your connection to? Are you conscious about the tradition of Western thinking? How do you connect that?
I definitely connect to it. I have a lot of references towards either painters that reference antiquity, or I have kind of infused antiquity into my own work. So I am looking at these masters and how they painted things. I am looking at how contemporary artists are deriving from those. So when I'm rendering my figures, I am definitely coming from it from the standpoint of this is how I've learned to build. And I have a comfortability with that. But I also like to posit that as kind of like these human and landscape relationships. When I think about a body in space, I like to imagine that as their own person. And I'm I'm still developing how I can integrate those aspects a little more formally, but in the landscape, I want that to be informative of the person's mind, not the other way around.
So those differences are serving anger also, maybe?
Yeah,
Nature versus humanity?
Yeah, I let I am echoing. I let those moments kind of inform each other. Like I want the landscape to read alongside the figure, and I want those elements to inform a reading of it. And I hope that answers that question. Let me know if I'm not. Maybe I think I understand it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I think especially some of the early pieces, like portrait of herself in surrounded by the imaginary foliage before the MFA. How does that compare? Or how does this evolve from that?
Yeah, I wanted to include that painting. It was the first one in my slide. I am using a tablet, so I'm not going to pretend like this will be easy to slide through. So here we go. So when I added this painting, I wanted to include it to show that this has been something on my mind for a very long time. I entered the program knowing that I would want to explore other elements and to build on my understanding so that I could return back to this. And it definitely helped with the quarantine because I have this painting in my house. So I'm looking at it. I'm looking at it when I'm making my monotypes. I was looking at how this landscape begins to dissolve into the figure. And I'm also doing something very similar where I'm kind of representing this figure as a little more academically inclined. So.
And that was from high school.
Yes.
So your figures seem to be at ease in these environments. Can you talk a little bit about this sense of ease despite the distortion of abstraction of the landscape?
Yes. In my writing, I have an artist title, or her name is Lynette Yaidon Bokia, and she has a quote where she talks about how she represents figures. And she's also kind of working through these moments of academic painting and rendering of the figures, but she has these figures existing in spaces that are not necessarily grounded to space, place, or time even. And she says that these figures are, they command themselves and they're not necessarily concerned with the viewer's concerns or anxieties. So they're just kind of living in this, yes.
Okay, no, that's, thank you. So to follow up on that, those spaces in the next paintings they're kind of diffused, but here your paintings are very much alive. And I wanted to dovetail what you're just saying into another question about urgency. And you talk about urgency in your presentation. And these figures are at rest while the environment is agitated. That's the language that you use. Even going as far as using the phrase. You said my neighbor's house moves in the background. I believe it's
Yeah.
Can you talk about foreboding?
Yeah.
Not present in this.
Okay. In this work, I am using color as kind of this seductive trap. I want to bring people in to look at these narratives and enter into these paintings, maybe with different layers of understanding. But for me, whenever I compose an image or whenever I compose figures in space, I have a reason why I'm doing that. I want to convey some kind of message. So in these, I could explain it all, but I was explaining my little sisters and how I wanted them to have that connection, that support that I might not have had as a kid, or at least it took me a lot longer to get to where I see they are. So I'm able to draw people in that way. So I'm trying to convey a message.
Right, but I guess what I'm getting at is we're talking about urgency.
Yeah.
And there is, you know, the color and temperature of the paintings is very, very high, very hot. And these figures are going to pose, and I want you to connect that kind of like, where is it that all of these figures are sort of sedate a little bit, a little bit
Yeah.
quiet. So talk to me about this connection of urgency, color, and foreboding.
Okay. When I think about these moments, I usually approach the initial reaction to why I'm making the painting with some sort of anger, honestly, an anger or a rage. And I don't want to talk about that moment. For me, I'm interested in the subtleties of the moment after. So my paintings have a stillness to them because I'm trying to transcribe that and convey it in my way. I can expand.
I can keep picking on it, but I want to.
Okay.
That was a very interesting answer.
Well, I'm not sure I question about urgency, but
Well,
it's just,
what term that she's in.
Okay.
but it does mean that we want to, which I imagine quicker, and then maybe more immediate. The painting are resolved. There does a sense of urgency, right? And that's the speed at which they're made. They seem, like you said, more subdued. Is that subtlety is a more perfect representation of what you're trying to do, rather than more immediate on.
Kind of gestural mono.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a question there.
I'm trying to decode. All right. So in the monotypes, yes, they did. I've always had this kind of trouble of spending a very long time on my paintings to where my message and maybe the intended outcome kind of slow down somewhere in between. So in the monotypes, I did work on that. I was working on that expressive kind of feeling that I felt about something and I wanted to capture it. In the paintings, I did actually have moments where it would kind of elude me because it would take me a while to get to. But I still tried to capture that urgency of this quick brushstrokes. Like in this painting here, I have this splatter, the painting Sticks, Stones, Roots, and Bones. I have this water splatter on the floor. I have these dogs that are kind of agitated and moving in the way that, a small dog would do. And I try and capture this looming sensibility. And that is definitely informed by some of the readings that I've done, where I'm more inclined to look for those moments of heightened emotion in a genre setting. So that's where that's coming from.
Which I have a great thing for
I'm struggling too, because what I worked with Sheherazade for a while. I didn't get to see this painting even real until we all finally could get out of activity. And I watched you develop it. And everyone in the class kept trying to identify the time and the place. And it occurs to me as I recall work, and I've always known this, but I didn't realize how much. There is no time and place in any of these. The idea that focus on temperature and color kind of messes up.
Yeah.
I love what you said about that. So will you once more talk about stopping time? Why is that so important to you in your work?
Okay. In this painting, I mentioned coming home. So the light in this painting is informed by a car light. So it's very high key. Everything is very harsh. but I'm also representing the sunset as an earlier time in the day. So it's kind of creating that mental discord between an earlier moment and a nighttime still scene. So in this painting, The Hands That Hold You, I'm doing something very similar where I'm trying to capture the sunset as well. In South Florida, it's very specifically a landmark of that area where you see these bright pink horizons, and they're kind of ominous. I've heard talks about that being a piece of global warming or pollution in the air, but I like that just beauty, seeing these moments that are heightened and capturing those spaces.
You made reference to Afro-Caribbean color.
Mhm.
Where does that come from? What are you looking at?
Okay, I'm not necessarily looking at artists for the Afro-Caribbean color. I'm looking at artifacts. So when I think about altarpieces or having just these high key color moments in objects that I feel Afro-Caribbean descendants or just African descendants as well, or just the diaspora, excuse me. The high key color informs this kind of urgency as well. They inform symbols, symbolic uses of color. I started to think about my mother's home and how she wanted to capture the sense of living in Martinique. And she painted all of the walls in her house, these really bright colors. So I wanted to pull from that. I wanted to pull from things like this doll that are high chromatic. It's a little bit obscured in the photograph because I'm blurring the background, but I was just surrounded by these high chroma objects. And this is what I meant by altered objects, artifacts. So that's kind of what I mean with the high key.
Do a follow-up question to that idea?
So you mentioned having sort of romantic connections to Martinique, right, as a second generation American. And you mentioned that the paintings, the small photos that you have, acted as a bridge.
Mm-hmm.
Have these paintings created that bridge that you were looking for, or can you discuss that a little bit more?
Yeah, they're definitely coming from this place of yearning, of wanting to understand my family and the stories that they tell, just the stories, and how they'd reminisce about those things, and how when I'd read about, there's a ton of writers from Martinique that were academics, and they spoke about the politics, they talked about the social goings on. I wanted to connect all of those things together, but also thinking about my interpretations of those things, because I've not been able to go. I've never been, I've just heard and filtered that my whole life. So yes, I do feel like they allowed me to bridge those moments. They also helped me reflect on them as well. And when I arranged them, I was able to kind of see how clusters, I didn't picture any of them, but I wanted to see how clusters would speak to one another, how an embrace could be after a dance, or how that dance could be after a festival or a just kind of communion. So yeah, I did get to bridge that connection for myself.
I have a question about the end. You talked about wanting these pieces to be objects, and so you painted the edges to them to make them more object-like. Why is that important to paintings as narrative or portraiture? Why is that important to be objects?
I want to say that that's definitely something I wanted to see more so as an artist. I don't know if it Well, I do. It does inform the mark making as going from all the way from corner to corner, from edge to edge. I wanted to see that happen. For the image, I got to re-enter into some of these paintings that I made earlier on when I made that decision. But I also wanted to see it from a mark making perspective. I wanted to see those marks carried through.
I'm not following. So
Okay.
you just want to make more marks?
Essentially, I did want to carry the image all the way across. And when they're exhibited, I wanted to see how that would inform against a white wall or whatever color or tonation of wall. I wanted to see how that carried from, because when I look at it from here and I can see this painting of my uncle, which I have here for Zoom. From where I'm standing, I see this tree extend. I see how it kind of wraps around, and then I start to wonder what's next. Like, where does the rest of this image come from? So this was also a decision that I made after hearing numerous times that it is a sort of taboo to wrap your edges, to wrap your paint. And I've made a lot of my decisions off of breaking those small conventions. So even if it's glitter I'm adding, if it's rhinestone, mother of pearl, things that I want to put in my paintings, I usually come back to those, think about them, and imagine how I can break those rules.
So if it was an experiment, so to speak, you wanted to see what it looked like, what do you think of that experiment?
I love it. I love it. I was very excited when I completed that one, and it was kind of it just happened. All of them were done within a day. So I will definitely continue it with these wooden 30 by 40 pieces. The canvas pieces, on the other hand, I'm not as convinced by, so I let those be raw. And if I want to frame them eventually, I will frame them. But these, I like how they exist on the wall as an object.
You think that has something to do with the fact that they're portraits?
I think it's the orientation and how I'm thinking about the framing of these 30 by 40s. They're longer portraits that deal with very concise messages. And some of the larger canvases, they do still deal with concise messages, but there's more room for interpretation. There's more information usually. So that's partly why.
I have a question.
Okay.
Are you done? No, go ahead. No, because mine is really tough.
Okay.
So if it's about sort of breaking the rules, breaking conventions, then why stick with a rectangle?
I am working through that now. I was imagining some of these paintings being scrolls or just kind of letting them hang on the wall. But that has not happened in my practice yet. It's something that I'm considering.
You mentioned imposter syndrome once,
Okay.
and you never really elaborated on that. What is imposter syndrome for you?
So imposter syndrome, I experience that all over the place. Like, I am a generally introverted person. So when I am presenting, like now, I'm imagining all these other possibilities of worthiness, of things that I am portraying out in the world, and I'm reflecting on them. So when I was making these paintings of my family, I was thinking about how I am so incredibly American. I have all of this experience of living here, and they have this experience of living somewhere else. And that informed how they move throughout the world, and it informed how me as a child was thinking about them. And I wanted to bridge those anxieties a little bit. So imposter syndrome exists everywhere, but I might be kind of letting that question get away.
Maybe I want you to answer it in the context of the magical realism,
Okay,
because maybe that is a
okay.
of reality of living the way, I don't know, we're told that we're supposed to. Maybe we
Yeah.
can address it in that way.
Okay, so some of the magical realism that enters these paintings where they are representing genre, still lives generally, they're simple actions, simple gestures, but I am carrying all of this emotion into them, all of this intuitive mark making for them. A lot of them are experiencing otherness. They're being othered by a larger community, and I am expressing how that feels in these. So there's imposter syndrome in that as well. Yeah.
So you referenced Deanna Lawson in your presentation. I want to know maybe how her work affected your decision making.
Okay.
She's got a big span of the work, photos, the interiors, but they're also really problematic.
Yeah.
Can you discuss?
I agree. So I love Deanna Lawson's imagery. I love that she kind of unflinchingly enters into these spaces and represents aspects of interior family lives. But at the same time, sometimes that's kind of pornographic in the sense of the literal word of being explicitly showing things that may not need to be shown, not necessarily in terms of sex, just clearing that up. So Deanna Lawson's imagery functioned here as well as being this very vulnerable moment. It's depicting a man in mourning in the community garden that his church built after a serious murder, a mass shooting. And I was informed by this in terms of the composition. I was informed by what this man's face and his posture were telling me. And that's where I was pulling from these images. I was informed by how she was composing spaces. Yes.
Okay, I have another question because I feel like it's
Okay.
I don't see you making this mention, especially in the previous slide.
Okay.
You have this repeated image, especially in the newer works of the landscape consuming home or consuming the person. Can you please discuss that further and the relevance of that in your decision making or your image making?
So at the time, I actually saw this image first, and not just this image, but all of the images that Deanna Lawson has featured figures in landscape. And I was wanting to bridge that connection. As you saw in my earlier work, I was always kind of interested in focusing on figures and landscape. But when I looked for references of figure and landscape, I didn't see paintings of that. I was trying to make these paintings, and I was also thinking about representation in terms of the artists I was seeing. So Deanna Lawson was an artist that showed me that representation really early. I was starting to see it. And now in 2022, I see it all the time, and it's wonderful, but I didn't have that when I was a student. So I also have a section of research in my thesis of Caroline. Her first name's Caroline. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her last name, but she made this book of an essay called Black Faces, White Spaces, where she approaches the lack of Black figuration in landscape spaces. So I've been researching that. I wanted to see how I could take my novel day to day and put it into painting and think about, but not necessarily having to express directly why that's important. I wanted to kind of be that thing that I didn't get to see.
But you didn't mention the idea of the landscape.
Oh.
People, it's pretty, they're pretty
Clear.
That's that.
Yes, so I only chose 3 of these paintings, and these 3 feature like a figure in the distance, like coming from the beach, a figure falling away into this wading water with like kind of a foggy background, and this figure here, which I'm going to stop at, of me in this space where I'm crouched. And I remember expressing that the lily plant looks like it's consuming the figure. I wanted to kind of, in all of these, animate certain aspects of the landscape and give them ideas of personality, give them suggestions, without necessarily having to illustrate that entirely. So I reacted to this because these figures are isolated in space. This landscape informs their kind of shell and their bubble. And when I'm out in these spaces, or how I've come to reference these images, that's how I felt. And I wanted to capture that.
Yeah, but I'm also.
Yes.
I'm expressing this because here, there, right? And so I want to know, okay, if you consider that, and if I need to process it, with that question or not, but I didn't see that in the discussion. So
Okay.
I'll stand down.
Oh, no, for sure. I think in my household and in my surrounding spaces, there's always been this there's just generally been a lot of plants kind of informing my exterior or interior. No matter what apartment I lived in with my mom, she always had a ton of plants. And she took a lot of care of them. We would have worm farms on our balconies, and she would feed the fish with them, but the manure would go to feeding the plants. So I like this idea of having this surrounding, this comfort of this plant life. And I've given it personality through these paintings. I also have a lot of my formative memories through gardening. Like this one, I was nicknamed Petunia as a child. So I'm putting them in the ground, and which is another thing that I did between like 5 different houses. But I was just pulling from that bankment of memory. Yes.
Wait, I'm a little surprised you're saying that the landscape is comforting for you.
Yes, so I think it has a dual element of being both comforting and this intense presence. Like it could be just a reference towards, Mother Nature as being this force that's unpredictable, this force that has the ability to shroud and reveal what it wants. So I want to keep those elements at play.
I think you just answered my question. One more thing, I guess. I love what you said about being angry. Angry, sometimes even when you're conceiving of pain, probably quite angry.
Yeah.
And then allowing the emotion that comes after anger to be depicted in the
Mm-hmm.
And then I was reminded of the photograph right after this one
Yes.
by Deanna Lawson, but if you don't mind moving into that one. And the man sitting after,
this one.
of course, the
Was it this one?
Yes, that one.
Okay.
Okay, so I feel like this may be the parallel. And that man had to be very angry. And now what emotion are you reading in that figure sitting there? The resignation, is it something else?
Yeah. When I was presenting this one, I also kind of made that parallel between seeing this in 2015. I actually saw it a little bit later than that. So it was a little bit closer to my grandmother. But I was thinking about that feeling of mourning, and how this terrible happening has affected his life moving forward. It's affected how he's seeing everything around him. And that's going to take time to process. Yeah. No? Okay. Yes.
We could be the whole day. It's continuing to.
That's up to the committee.
It's up to you if you have more questions. This is her defense.
So what is it about, what is it about sort of science fiction and work that you read
Mhm.
that made the groundwork for it? So what is that connection?
Okay. I'm just looking at this slide.
Yeah, and you mentioned our favorite book and the Purple Solar.
100 Years of Solitude.
Solitude is that.
I like how they turn these moments of admonition, I think is the word I'm looking for. It's that moment of like a terrible happening and how they process it and how they turn something so difficult into something beautiful. So like this painting by Kerry James Marshall, I have him processing how he's feeling about the art world and how they've pretty much exclusively left him out, and he's made work about that, and how he decided to focus on something that is beautiful, that is almost seen as frivolous, but it's also an act of resistance. And 100 Years of Solitude, it's also an act of resistance. It's following this family and it's being made near certain wars and colonialism, just the effects of those things and how that colors this family's movement through life, and how Parable of the Sower, they're dealing with very real, almost hilariously the year of 2022, written 2 years before I was even born, of things that we're facing right now. So the book, as I said, I didn't want to spoil it for anybody who might have wanted to read it, but it ends. I won't. I'm good with that. It processes those hard emotions through ways that most humans do, through faith, through just like things that keep them waking up in the morning. So that's where those tales of fiction kind of weave their ways into my work.
Okay, I got a question, a big one. If no one asked it, I thought for sure you were going at this one. So where do you fit in contemporary art?
So I was thinking a lot about the work of other contemporary artists, specifically young, queer, Black, or other people of color, and how they're all kind of engaging in this. A lot of times it's really focusing on what happened when they were younger and how those things have been processed into power, how they processed into how they've interpreted the world. And I wanted to engage in those conversations too. I wanted to make sure that my work had the relevance, even if it's just to myself, of being able to speak with others that might be going through the same thing. I remember in Chamois, that miniature series, I was talking with other just people my age, people who might have had parents who were immigrants, wanting to find that connection. And on some level they have, and, or I have, they've mentioned it to me. That's what I was living out. But in some of these works as well, or all of these works, I am dealing with a problem and I'm trying to convey it. So those problems are all contemporary in my eyes. They're dealing with they're dealing with all kinds of things, really. It's Blackness. It's dealing with moving through trying to get a job, and you're dealing with colorism. You're dealing with all kinds of these big concepts and I'm breaking them down into things that I can make work about.
Anybody want to follow up or keep going?
If you want, I think it's a good answer for young artists. At one time, I think this is the one that is going to be, I'm understanding it more as a more public painting, a dialogue with the larger public, because of we all have to assimilate into this country that is supposed to be a melting pot.
And then you learn that it's not.
And my generation was different from your generation, where we didn't get to know very much about our ancestry either, because the parents were trying so hard to disguise it all. And I don't know about your mother's generation. It's very interesting. If you notice, I think a very important element in this painting is something that probably does hang in the house. And that's that American Eagle over that garage door.
Yeah.
It just lasts out, it always has. You could have taken it off.
She could have too. So there was a flag there. Was there a question I should follow through? Okay.
Why did you put it in there? And why did you keep it in there? Was it because it's there?
So, I might have lost it just now, but I was thinking about those dinner table talks where I do get to bridge those gaps between generation and generation. And that was what a lot of those contents were. It was talking about their experience, my mom's experience, and my experience, and just thinking about how each generation has interpreted the information of, like civil rights, to having grandparents that I can't even trace my ancestry that far back to. So it's just this filtering.
So that yellow room that's illuminated there is the yellow room back here.
Oh, no. So this painting is dealing with my interior spaces, and so is this painting. This room is my mother's room, so it's very literally just her room. She works there, she meditates there, she has altars probably in the 10s and 20s amount in every little corner. And they deal with kind of this return to peace. They also, I don't want to go too much into what she's doing, but yeah, it's just a place that she kind of returns to.
I'm done with my questions.
Okay.
I'll ask you later.
Okay.
Because I'm gonna ask, I just asked her to put these things over the rest of the.
No. I'm just confirming with
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Okay. Right. I'll stop.
All right.
Well, I'm gonna ask you later.
Sounds good.
Then it is time to open up questions to the audience. Our members on Twitter, chat, or raise their hands. Also members of the audience.
All right.
So as you investigate history and a variety of things that you're referencing outside, does history and displacement affect your capacity to connect to Western traditional thinking and how you
Yes, because I feel that a lot of those things existed outside of painting, and they're easily talked about outside of that in terms of documentary ideas. So that's why I have so many photographers that I reference. I don't have too many in this presentation, but Deanna Lawson is a documentary artist. And because of that and the quickness of that media, I see things about those histories of displacement, those histories of living in this world more rapidly. Do you want me to expand on another aspect?
If you could expand on it a little.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess just in terms of, I just see so many different references in your work, and I think that it's difficult to kind of trace that. So I guess maybe even if you can give us an idea of some of those like Western traditional thinkers that have people to
Western traditional painters.
like some of the older thinkers that we kind of
Okay.
and say, what are you then looking at some painters or some work that you're seeing that's maybe not as well documented, but from the Caribbean?
Yeah, I immediately think of Hector Hippolyte. Hector Hippolyte is a Haitian voodoo priest. He's no longer living, but he made these works that were they inspired a lot of the mark making in my monotypes for how free and how fast he worked on them, how he captured figures. And I felt that his work did not get the screen time it needed in history. It needed to be seen more. So I think about narratives like that, where they're, especially in art history books, going back to what I experienced as a student, I didn't get that information. So I'm kind of bridging those gaps now. And there's a whole history of Caribbean artists, a whole history of African artists, a whole history of all of this Black experience that exists, but you have to work really hard to find it. So it is coming from that feeling as well. And in terms of displacement in Western work, I think about Goya. That's sort of kind of Western, but I think about those images of extreme tension in the world and how they've captured those things. I think about those images of resistance and how they're freezing moments in time. Sometimes it's like Kathy Kalowitz, who's expressing these moments of stillness after dealing with a harrowing experience. So yeah, okay. Thank you. All right.
That kind of leads to take all the question I have. You mentioned Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sour, which is a post-apocalyptic story, and you also mentioned the specific meaning of Simone's song Cinnamon. And I wanted to know if you could talk more about how that imagery entered your work and include that image, how you deal with those references to your imagery and the way you're rendering the landscapes, spaces, and even the figures as well.
In Parable of the Sour, there are tons, and I'm having to filter so I don't spoil it. There are tons and tons of moments where they describe this fire that is angry, that is not lucid, that is the world as she's illustrating it. And I like to pull from that bankment of anger without putting my finger directly on it. So I like to reference fire. I like to reference that feeling of tension, that swallowing, all of those kind of jarring moments. I want to put them in my paintings. So I think about those rising tensions, and I also think about the climax of the story and how the characters of each of those moments deal with it, how they process those emotions, how they process that rising tension. Did that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. Okay.
The queer artist and the also mentioned sexuality, and you also referenced queer artists. Is that evident in your work a subject, sexuality and queerness?
So it absolutely is. I live in this space where I am still dealing with some of the hardest emotions in myself. So I go about these paintings with desire, essentially. Like I try and put desire into all of my works. I'm trying to access something that is difficult to reach. So for me, painting queerness, painting those kind of big umbrella terms in my work I don't deal with those moments of love kind of like Harry James Marshall directly. I think about the love of my community. So I don't have all of the friends that I have, you know, I've made connections with, but I do have friends that have helped me through that identity process of exploring myself. So just like the rising climaxes of a story in fiction, I'm thinking about how these tensions can be seen from a post perspective. So as I'm building the series, I am getting more comfortable talking about these things. And I feel like they're evident without being super descriptive right now. So somebody had pointed out to me that the table and the chair, that negative spacing, which functions very similarly to this tree, where it's a negative space of a positive subject. I put this kind of prism of color, like like the flag, essentially. And for me, that's touching on enough. I get to talk about it without having to be super descriptive of it. And I'm living in my home, essentially, where I get to think about those things all day. So it's there without being incredibly, I repeated that. So, yeah, yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about the color that you use in your work? Do you provide like a certain like significance between each individual color? And like why some of the figures are so attractive?
Yeah, for sure. So I get that question a lot, especially after making this painting with my little sisters, where they're distinctly a pink and distinctly a green. I wanted to talk about that comparison of them, of like their emotional states. And that's why I left it that way. But initially it was a formal reaction. So So underneath this painting, there's a gradient that I began with. So I knew that I wanted to talk about a rising tension up top and a grounding moment on the bottom. So I worked kind of top down on the background. And then when I got to the figures, I wanted to keep that gradient of informing them moving down. And that makes a lot of sense in my head, but you see aspects of transparency underneath these colorful figures. And I did talk about it a little bit in terms of wanting to talk about Black experience as a tonal thing. It's not experienced the same for everybody, yet everybody that I'm talking about and I am filtering through is Black, right? So I want to talk about how my uncle is a light-skinned Black man, or how in this photo between me and my mom, my grandmother, not my great-grandmother, but I remember growing up with them and thinking about like how I didn't quite look like them, but all of my phenotypical features match theirs. And then this is in my thesis, but I do talk about and expand on how that moment, how being othered from my own family made me want to approach these things. So this is very long-winded, but in these figures, I am dealing with something very reactionary immediately. And then in some of my other figures, I'm kind of undulating between naturalism and unnatural color. So I don't want to pigeonhole myself into only representing color as emotional, intuitive responses. But I said that backwards. I do want to react to them intuitively. So I move between all these different formats. Yes.
So, the personal connection to nature and the first connection to things like mango trees, and looking at cinnamon, probably very like typical funerary flower, and you're discussing the end times and your engagement with post-apocalyptic themes. Do you think a lot
on the like sort of mythology of these plants, the historical uses and depictions and arguments they like occupy when doing these paintings, you think about what they've been typically used for and what you're now using them for, or do you connect more with personal history more so than historical?
So yes to both of those parts. So when I was putting these peace lilies in, that was one of the things that my mom had everywhere. And when my grandmother passed, they threw so many of them at my mom that it's kind of a banned plant. So we no longer have things like that. And symbolically, I think about the color white of being this pure thing socially, and wanting to have this callback to those peace moments, have these callbacks to these war of fire, etc. But to answer that specifically, yes, the peace lily, the mango trees, these lemongrass, like all of these things are useful. So I think about them in terms of use. I think about them in terms of symbols, calling back to just how I've seen them represented throughout time. And yeah, like in this painting here, like I have a personal memory associated with this plant. So maybe not, because if you look for any of these, they're going to have different interpretations per whoever's writing it. Maybe I don't have those specific things, but I have my own coding for why I'm choosing to represent these. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about your curation of this final showcase, specifically why you chose these colors for the walls?
Yeah, so right before I think you got here, Carla mentioned that this wall and this title wall share a color, right? And when I was putting together these things, this one was the only one that was kind of that unknown. But when I put my painting against it, it made the sky react so vibrantly that I couldn't ignore that. And additionally, I think about maximalism a lot. I think about how I can kind of create a space, and white walls don't do it for me. I like them thematically, how they've been used with work, but I like to inform them with some other elements if I can, if the space allows for it, and they did. I chose this purple because it's an undercurrent element in all of my paintings. It's almost the same exact color, and it's hiding. It's not loud, but it's there. So I wanted to kind of use that to bounce back these, this tonal gradient that's still visible, and the green on that painting. I liked how they kind of wrapped the image for me. And then with these, I was expressing the wrapping and how that worked against a white wall. So I was playing with all kinds of different things, but in the way that they talk to each other, I wanted to have these monotypes as they related to what I worked on over COVID and how that became a product of that. But these monotypes are also dealing with aspects of the house. And then I'm framing all of these as elements of my house, except this one, which is dealing with my friend outside. And then these two mirroring interiors. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
What have you gained or lost by intentionally positive outlook, positive content?
Please rephrase. I don't understand.
You mentioned how you intentionally chose to inspire a new positive direction, commentary.
So kind of like that moment of stillness and choosing not to, okay.
Positive or to have a positive outlook. I might be slightly misrepresenting it. It's correct.
That's okay. I do want to explore some other aspects of that, but I don't think that those will appear in the form of paintings. They might be more gestural with drawing or monotype. So that's more of a thing that I want to approach in the future. I want to see every element of this space as I continue to kind of panorama each event. But for the positive outlook, for me at least, it deals with a resolution in my mind about whatever that subject is. So for me, that's why I'm going about that.